A couple of summers ago, a guy named Ray Shelton drove 4 hours to Lake Okeechobee for a weekend tournament. Brand new Shimano reel, $300 worth of swim baits hand-picked from a pro shop in Tampa. He had done everything right. Watched the tutorials, studied the contour maps, pre-fished the spot twice. After 14 hours on the water, Ray came back to the dock with 2 undersized largemouths and a cooler full of warm beer. On his way to the parking lot, he noticed an old-timer sitting on a 5-gallon bucket near the boat ramp, stringing up a stringer of fat bass. No fancy reel, no boat, and on the ground next to him was a beat-up plastic soda bottle with holes drilled through it. Ray laughed and asked what that was about. The old man just shrugged and said, "This bottle right here catches more fish than everything in that tackle shop put together." That story has been bouncing around Florida fishing circles for years, and I used to think it was pure garbage, another old-timer tall tale. But then I started digging into the actual marine biology, and what I found made me angry. Not at the old man, but at an entire industry that buried this technique on purpose. Welcome to Forbidden Lures. Today, I am going to show you how a single discarded PET bottle, a piece of trash you tossed in the recycling bin this morning, can triple your catch rate, pull fish from over 100 feet away, and absolutely dominate murky water when nothing else works. I will walk you through how to build it, the hardcore science of why it triggers predatory strikes, and the dark ecological reason why this technique was stamped forbidden. Stay with me. This one is going to change how you think about fishing forever. The Great Tackle Industry Cover-Up. Walk into any big box outdoor store right now. Go ahead, picture it. Row after row after row of plastic. Scented soft plastics that lose their scent after 4 casts. $19 crankbaits that snag on the first submerged log. $30 swim baits with holographic paint jobs that impress your fishing buddy but do absolutely nothing for the fish. That is not a tackle aisle. That is a dependency machine. The modern fishing industry has conditioned you to believe that catching fish requires constant, relentless consumption. Keep buying, keep guessing, keep coming back for the next magic lure. And if you do not catch anything, well, it must be your technique. Better watch another video, better buy another bait. But here is the thing nobody talks about. In the 1970s and early 80s, during the recession, anglers across the South were using a technique so cheap and so effective that it spread like wildfire through parking lots, local bait shops, and fishing magazines. They called it the poor man's fish magnet. You took a plastic bottle, drilled some holes in it, loaded it with cheap bait, and dropped it near structure. Within 90 minutes, you had located and pulled every active fish in the area. Cost? $0. So ask yourself this: what happened to it? Where did it go? I will tell you exactly where it went. It got erased. Because an attractor that you build once from household trash and reuse for years is an absolute nightmare for a corporate business model built on disposable products. By the 1990s, televised bass fishing exploded. The narrative shifted to high-tech sonar and proprietary soft plastics engineered for planned obsolescence. The tackle shops stopped mentioning the bottle trick. Magazines stopped printing it. And within 1 generation, a proven, biologically effective fish-pulling system was scrubbed from the modern angler's playbook. Until now. The science of the strike. Why a plastic bottle destroys commercial lures. To understand why this works, you have to forget almost everything the tackle industry has taught you about how fish find your lure. If you think bass or catfish are scanning the water with their eyes, searching for the prettiest colored bait, you are dead wrong. And the industry loves that you believe it, because pretty colors sell product. Here is the truth. Fish experience the underwater world in layers. And the secret to the PET bottle's dominance is something marine biologists call compound signaling. That is a fancy term for a simple three-step process. Fish detect vibrations first, they follow scent second, and they only use their eyes at the very last moment to confirm the strike. Vibration, scent, then vision, in that order. Let me break that down so it sticks. First, vibration. Imagine standing in a pitch-black room. You cannot see anything, but someone walks past you and you feel the air pressure shift on your skin. You know exactly where they are without seeing them. That is what a fish's lateral line does, except 1,000 times more sensitive. It is a system of receptors running down the length of the fish's body that detects low-frequency vibrations and pressure changes in the water. Now, a plastic bottle has walls so thin they are a fraction of a millimeter thick. When current flows around and through that bottle, those thin walls flex and vibrate. Think of it like a drum skin so thin that even a gentle current makes it hum. That hum mimics the vibration signature of struggling prey, and a fish can feel it from a massive distance. Second, scent. And this is where it gets nasty. Did you know that a catfish is basically a swimming tongue? Their entire bodies, not just their whiskers, their entire bodies are covered in taste receptors that can detect amino acids and oils at concentrations of parts per billion. To put that in perspective, that is the equivalent of tasting a single drop of hot sauce dissolved in an Olympic swimming pool. Now, think about your standard soft plastic lure. You drag it through the water and it leaves a thin little scent trail that vanishes in about 45 seconds. Pathetic. The PET bottle? It is a continuous release chemical delivery system. Water flows through the holes, picks up dissolved amino acids and oils from the bait inside, and streams it out the other side in a massive, cone-shaped scent plume that lasts for hours. Not minutes, hours. That scent plume is a chemical highway. The fish hits the gradient, locks on, and follows it upstream directly to your strike zone. You are not hoping they swim past your lure. You are chemically summoning them to your exact position. And that is why a $30 swim bait with a 90-second scent window cannot compete with a free plastic bottle that pumps out a chemical beacon for 6 hours straight. It is not even close. Section 3. Building the forbidden fish magnet. All right. Now that you understand why this works, let me show you exactly how to build it. And pay attention, because the engineering on this matters. Get the hole placement wrong, and you will either trap 0 scent inside or wash out your bait in 10 minutes. There is a sweet spot, and I am going to hand it to you. Grab a clear PET bottle, anywhere between 1.5 and 3 liters. Rinse it completely, and I mean completely, because residual sugar from soda will actually attract the wrong species and create a mess. Clear plastic is crucial. It lets fish see the silhouette and movement of bait inside, which triggers that final visual confirmation we just talked about. Now you have a choice. You can build this as a trap or as a pure attractor. For a trap, cut off the top neck of the bottle and invert it back inside, creating a funnel. Small bait fish like mullet swim in straight lines. They will push through the funnel to get to the food, but they lack the spatial awareness to turn around and escape. Simple, brutal, effective. For an attractor, which is what most of you will want, Take a 3/16-inch drill bit and create exactly 12 holes in a spiral pattern around the body of the bottle, starting 2 inches from the bottom. Now, why 12? Not 8, not 20? Because 12 holes at that diameter create the perfect flow rate for a steady 4 to 6 hour scent plume. Fewer holes, and the scent barely trickles out. More holes, and the current washes your bait clean in under an hour. 12 is the number. Trust the engineering. Weighting and deployment. Drop lead sinkers or smooth stones inside so the bottle sinks and holds the bottom. Fill it about 3/4 of the way with water, leaving a small air pocket so the bottle hovers at a 45-degree angle in the current. And here is where 90% of guys mess this up. You must squeeze out all excess air before sealing it. If you leave too much air inside, the buoyancy causes the bottle to tumble around aimlessly instead of holding steady in the strike zone. Tie a heavy section of paracord to the neck. Drop it near a ledge, a drop-off, or submerged brush, and get ready. Because what happens next is going to change your fishing life. Grocery store magic, the $0 bait arsenal. Now comes the question everyone asks. What do you put inside that bottle? And this is where it gets almost ridiculous, because the answer is stuff you already have in your kitchen. Forget the $30 bottle of synthetic fish gel. Forget the proprietary scent formulas with the fancy marketing. The most effective baits for this system come from your grocery store, and they cost less than a cup of coffee. For species like mullet and carp, anything that feeds on plants and starches, use the oldest trick in the book, a simple mixture of wheat flour and water. When you pack that dough into the bottle, it slowly dissolves and releases starches and amino acids into the water column. It creates a milky white cloud that visually mimics a feeding frenzy. Carp see that cloud, and they lose their minds. They cannot resist it. For predatory fish, bass, catfish, pike, anything with teeth and an attitude, you want lipids and oils. Chunks of cut bait fish work beautifully. Chicken liver wrapped in a piece of pantyhose to keep it from disintegrating too fast is a legendary catfish trick. Canned dog food soaked in anise oil. Even tuna packed in oil. The key is fat. Fish oils are hydrophobic, which means they do not dissolve and vanish instantly. They ride the current and form a persistent, greasy trail that can last for hours. Want to go nuclear? Add garlic powder or straight tuna oil into your mix. That garlic punch cuts through water like nothing else. But here is the secret nobody talks about, the one that separates a good catch from a legendary one. Your body naturally produces an amino acid called L-serine. Every human does. And to a cautious, trophy-sized fish, L-serine is a giant neon warning sign that screams, "Predator! Danger! Stay away!" You secrete it through your skin, and every time you handle your line, your bottle, or your bait with bare hands, you are painting that warning signal all over your gear. The fix is dead simple. Handle everything, your bottle, your bait, your leader, with hands that have been rubbed down with garlic juice or anise oil. It completely masks your human scent signature. The fish's guard drops, and instead of cautious, tentative nibbles, you get aggressive, fully committed strikes. That single tip alone is worth more than every fancy lure in your tackle box combined. Dominating the elements, when everyone else goes home. Picture this. A massive thunderstorm just rolled through central Florida. The sky is still dark. The water looks like chocolate milk. Every guy with a $50,000 bass boat is loading up and heading for the trailer. Their $600 electronics are useless. Their beautiful visual lures might as well be invisible. And one angler is still out there, grinning. This is where the PET bottle does not just work, it dominates. When visibility drops to zero, a fish's entire survival system shifts to its lateral line and its sense of smell. Eyes become useless. Vibration and scent become everything. And guess what your bottle is pumping out non-stop? Both. But here is what most people do not realize about post-storm conditions. That rain runoff does not just make the water dirty, it cools the surface temperature and spikes the dissolved oxygen content. Think of it like pouring espresso shots into the lake. The fish are not sluggish and hiding, they are energized. They are in a hunting frenzy. They are actively searching for food. And your bottle is the only thing in the water broadcasting a signal they can find. While everyone else is blind casting and praying, you drop your loaded bottle into a deeper, stable pocket of water behind a point or near a channel ledge. The scent of tuna oil or fermented cutbait cuts through that turbidity like a laser beam through fog. The fish lock onto that chemical gradient and track it through the absolute darkest, muddiest water straight to your hook. Remember Ray Shelton, that Florida angler I mentioned at the top of this video? That old-timer on the bucket at Okeechobee was fishing a post-storm grass flat. He pulled 14 bass, while the rest of the lake caught nothing. 14. From a plastic bottle and a handful of cut shad. Still think you need a $300 tackle haul to catch fish? Or are you starting to understand why the industry wants this technique buried? The dark truth. Why this technique is actually forbidden. Now, I need you to stop thinking like an angler for a minute. Think like an ecologist. Because the reason this technique carries the word forbidden is not just about corporate profits. There is a much darker, much more dangerous truth here, and you need to hear it before you ever deploy one of these bottles. It is called ghost fishing, and it is one of the most destructive forces in our waterways. PET plastic is engineered to last for centuries. That is great when you are drinking a soda. It is catastrophic when a bottle trap is lost underwater. If your line snaps, or you forget where you dropped it, that bottle does not stop working. It becomes a permanent, autonomous killing machine. Here is how the death cycle works. A fish swims into the lost bottle and cannot escape. It starves. Its body begins to decay, releasing a scent plume into the water. The exact same scent mechanism that made the bottle so effective in the first place. That decay scent attracts scavengers. Crabs, crawfish, larger fish, they enter the bottle to feed on the carcass. They get trapped. They die. Their decay attracts the next wave, and the cycle repeats over and over and over for decades. One single lost bottle can kill hundreds of aquatic animals across its lifetime. And it gets worse. Over time, sunlight breaks that PET plastic down into microplastics, tiny fragments that end up embedded in the flesh of the very fish we are bringing home to feed our families. You are eating the plastic you left behind. This is not hypothetical. Ghost gear accounts for an estimated 10% of all marine litter globally and is directly responsible for devastating fish stocks worldwide. Because of this extreme lethality, authorities have cracked down hard. In Texas, it is strictly illegal to use plastic bottles of any color or size as buoys for crab traps or trot lines. In Vietnam, using destructive improvised gear that damages habitat can result in fines exceeding 100 million Vietnamese dong under Decree 38 of 2024. The technique is so hyper-efficient that if left unchecked, it leads directly to overharvesting and ecosystem collapse. That is why it is forbidden. Not because it does not work, but because it works too well and lasts too long. So where does that leave us? The PET bottle technique is a masterclass in aquatic biology. It is living proof that you do not need a wallet full of credit cards to outsmart the water. A basic understanding of how fish actually hunt, vibration, scent, then vision, combined with a piece of household recycling, gives you more fish-pulling power than most guys will ever buy at a tackle shop. But with that power comes a burden, and I am not saying that lightly. If you build one of these, you treat it with more respect than a $500 rod. You rig it securely, you mark its location, and you retrieve it every single time. No exceptions. We are here to break free from corporate consumerism and democratize fishing knowledge. But we are also the ones who have to protect the water. If we trash our lakes and rivers with plastic, there will not be any fish left for our kids to catch. Think about that old-timer at Lake Okeechobee. He did not need a fancy rig. He did not need a boat. He needed knowledge, patience, and a piece of recycling. And he outfished every guy at the ramp that day. Stop renting your fishing success $3 at a time. Start investing in knowledge that lasts a lifetime. If this video opened your eyes, smash that like button right now. Every single like tells the algorithm that real, unfiltered fishing knowledge deserves to reach guys who are tired of getting outfished by their own wallets. Subscribe to Forbidden Lures, because we are pulling the curtain back on suppressed techniques every single week. And drop a comment below with your home water, river, lake, reservoir, or coastline, and I will personally respond with how to adapt this scent dispersion system for your specific conditions. Fish smart, respect the water, and tight lines, brothers.